Hey, United Methodist Men of the North Georgia Conference. My name is Odell Horn. I'm the Men's Ministry Specialist, former conference president. And today we've been doing a series, as you all know, particularly for Black History Month. We've been going back. There's a saying that we have in African American studies: when you study Black history, do not begin with slavery. So we sort of adopted this: when you study Black Christianity, do not begin with slavery. So we went back before slavery. We wound up in West Africa, and we brought in a professor from the University of Georgia who talked to us about Christianity in West Africa, particularly in the Congo, prior to the slavery began. And then we even went back further than that, to the time period just after the New Testament. We brought in a professor, several professors, one from Yale University, another one from Concordia Seminary in St. Louis, as well as a doctoral student who's an Ethiopian descent, from Concordia Seminary in St. Louis. And they talked about Christianity in Ethiopia as well as in Egypt. And then we brought in some more professors the next year, one from Baylor University, one from Fuller Theological Seminary. And they talked about Christianity in Carthage as well as in Alexandria. All of this was during the early church time period. Well, we wanted to continue this series, and we wanted to have a conversation about Athanasius. Athanasius is one of the great theologians in antiquity. He is one of the defenders of orthodoxy. Athanasius, there's a famous saying, Athanasius Contra Mundum, Athanasius against the world. He was exiled several times, including once by Emperor Constantine, and his opponents called him the Black Dwarf. Athanasius also influenced some of the theology of John Wesley, who is the founder of the Methodist Church. And so we want to bring in a Coptic Orthodox priest who would further inform us on Athanasius, since his writings are still in circulation. And one of them includes On the Incarnation. And so we asked Father Nathaniel Gerges, who is the father and the lead pastor of St. Mark's American Coptic Orthodox Church in Sandy Springs, Georgia. Welcome, Father Gerges.
Thank you, Adele. I appreciate it. It's glad to be here.
All right, tell us about yourself. Tell us how you came to be a priest, but tell us where you were born. Tell us your family heritage, all of that information.
Sure. So in the 70s, my parents migrated from Egypt to America due to persecution, and they came in the 70s and kind of settled in Flint, Michigan, and they kind of grew up there. And then as my dad finished college, my parents met. When they finished college, they moved around America looking for a job. Ended up settling in outside of Chicago for a little bit. That's where I was born. And then we moved to Atlanta not that far after that. So from around the age of 3 till now, I've been a Southern boy. I kind of grew up in Atlanta. I lived in DC for about 9 years for college. But before that and now, I'm a Southern guy. I'm planting my roots here in Georgia. This is home for me. So, but ever since I was young, I grew up in the Coptic Orthodox Church, but have seen it tremendously evolve over the past 35 years. I mean, especially in the beginning, you have a large group being first generation immigrants, of them trying to figure out, okay, I am an Egyptian Christian. I am anchored in the reality of Orthodox Christianity, but what does that look like in America? So there has been an evolution in as far as the culture of that. What's the predominant language when it comes to the ethos or liturgical service of the church? And then as I continued to grow and kind of grow in spiritual maturity, I became more compelled to not just be passive about me being a follower of Jesus, but wanting to be all in. So that led me to kind of grow further. Ended up going to seminary after I graduated from graduate school. And then from there, the tradition in the Orthodox Church is you don't necessarily raise your hand and say, hey, I want to become a priest. It's called from the bishops themselves. So the bishop kind of, asked me, do you feel a conviction, or do you feel called to go into full-time ministry? I told him my life is not my own. if God wants to use me for that, awesome. If he wants to use me as a dentist, that was my profession before, sure. So, so we prayed about it, and I felt God was calling me into ministry. So it's been almost 5 years now that I've been in full-time ministry as a priest, serving a church in Sandy Springs, titled San Mark's Church.
So tell us a couple things, and I want you to talk about this, and I'm going to go get my copy of the Incarnation so everybody can see that it is still in print. But while I'm doing that, I want you to tell us where you went to school, your educational background, where you went to school, and then also tell us, expound more on Egyptian Christians and what's the origin of Egyptian Christians, and how has it evolved, and how did Egyptian Christians wind up in America?
Sure. Great question. So I guess for myself first, then I'll put it into the broader picture. I went to undergraduate school here in Georgia, in Athens, University of Georgia. I graduated a nutrition major, and then I went to dental school at Howard University in Washington, D.C. We stayed there. My wife and I stayed there for 4 years while I was finishing up dental school. We loved the community there. We loved the city. We loved our church there. So we ended up staying for several more years afterward, and kind of made that our home, and grew in Washington, D.C. And it was growing in that church. And then we felt called well, actually, once we found out we're having a kid, we said, let's move back down south to Georgia. Her parents were here, my parents were here, and that's when we settled in Atlanta. But kind of going into the broader picture, for a vast majority of Egyptian Christians, they came to America due to persecution, not necessarily just for, convenience, or that door naturally opened. It was just this natural pressure as the persecution continued to arise, and still obviously exists in Egypt, as Islam is the predominant religion there. They wanted to make sure that they're setting their kids' life for having better success in America. So many of them moved in the 70s or even before that. So it grew exponentially from there. And I keep on saying Egyptian Christian because that's just their nationality. But I want to emphasize, and moving forward, highlight that we are Coptic Orthodox Christians. And with those three words, Coptic Orthodox Christians, the emphasis is actually in the reverse order, that we are followers of Jesus first and foremost. Then from there, the version of Christianity, the version of us being a Jesus follower, what does that look like? That's through the Orthodox lens, which is the most ancient, organic version of Christianity. With all respect to any other version of Christianity, this is the fullness. This is the first century version of Christianity before it was diluted or distorted in any shape or form. The flavor of that Orthodox expression comes from Alexandria, Egypt. And this is where we get the word Coptic. Coptic just means Egyptian. So the emphasis is us being Christian, obviously. Orthodox is second, and then it being from Alexandria. So it then becomes Coptic Orthodox Christian. So just as there are different expressions of orthodoxy from different countries, you have Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Ethiopian Orthodox, you name it, Indian Orthodox. The theology, the fullness of spirituality of Christianity is there. The fullness of that theology is there, but the expression of it is different. It's kind of, you can say that it's like ice cream, and then the topping of it might change depending on where you're coming, right? Some people like strawberry, some people like chocolate, you name it, right? So the essence of it is still ice cream. The essence of it is still this pre-denominational Christian worldview. That's orthodoxy. And the expression of that is Coptic.
And one of the things that, first of all, this is the book on the Incarnation by Saint Athanasius. He was again he influenced John Wesley. One of the things that I want to point out is that Coptic is the last of the Pharaonic languages, correct?
Yes, sir.
So that means this is the last known language that we have of the pharaohs. And so there is a link not to what we have in Egypt today, which is the Egyptians with Arab admixture, but this is pre-Arab, correct?
Yes, sir. Yeah, I mean, the history and richness of the Coptic language obviously goes back, as you mentioned, Odell, from the Pharaonic era. And of course, it has evolved. It's been influenced by different cultures, and different people have come into Egypt. It has evolved, but it made a clear shift in the 6th century with the persecution of the Arab invasion. It came to the point where many of the Coptic Orthodox Christians' tongues were cut off if they spoke in Coptic, and if they proclaimed their faith. So from there, it was a big shift in the language even becoming more diminished. So you might find rural places in Upper Egypt in which Coptic is still a common language, but it has, due to persecution, it has really put a shift on the liturgical expression of the church and the language, obviously, that it is now not a common language at all. Even what's common in the diaspora of the Coptic Orthodox Church and all the other countries outside of Egypt, it is not the most common language used liturgically. It's either going to be Arabic or English that you find, or whatever the native tongue is. Like, for example, I visited a couple of years ago the Coptic Orthodox Church in Zambia. They were using their native tongue. So Coptic was not even in the picture, the language itself, as far as in liturgy, it was not there. So from the 6th, 7th century, it made a big shift, and Coptic being more of our heritage, but not necessarily a language that was used either liturgically or paraliturgically outside of liturgy.
Before we get into Athanasius, I really want you to go back to that 6th century. Tell us what happened 6th century, 6th, 7th century, to what was that shift?
Sure. The details I'm not familiar with, or I cannot remember in detail now from seminary, but for sure, it was a pivotal turning point if you look at the Coptic Orthodox Church or Egyptian history in general. Up to that point, Christianity was predominant. It was very open, and one of the leading countries and cities of Cairo and Alexandria specifically were one of the leading cities in the global economy as a whole, for various reasons. But as the Arab invasion came, their worldview involved persecution being an integral part. So, but what stuck out is that the Coptic Orthodox Christians were so strong in their identity as being followers of Christ. They were so strong in their heritage that they understood that this is nothing passive. This is nothing they just give up. They understood the richness of their faith, that they stood up for what was true, even if it required bloodshed. And bloodshed and martyrdom is the bedrock of specifically the Coptic Orthodox Church. I mean, even the liturgical calendar itself of how it is structured is focused on the shedding of blood of the martyrs. So the Saints, the martyrs, is an integral part for those who maybe have visited Egypt in the various churches. It is a pivotal part. Like we venerate the saints and the martyrs. We keep their relics, not in a way of kind of like worshiping them. That's not our theology whatsoever. But for us to wanting to emulate them of how they stood up for truth. So what happened during the Arab invasion? You see a tremendous amount of Coptic Christians standing up for truth, even if it required them to shed their blood. And this not only shifted the culture and had a big impact on the church itself. We lost many of our rites and rituals, to be honest, because of that persecution. Of course, oral tradition is an integral part to Orthodox Christianity as a whole, so many of it's still kept, but many of our literature, there was a lot of things that we did lose because of that. But it did not weaken the church, maybe temporarily, from at a 100-foot level, it looked like it weakened the church, but at a 10,000-foot level, it became the catalyst for the church to grow. And some historians would say it helped us, and I guess we'll talk about this later on, it helped put a division between your national identity as an Egyptian and then being a Coptic Orthodox Christian. Because of the persecution, because of the Arab invasion, we were able to put a distinct separation that, yes, I can say I am an Egyptian, but what identifies me is my worldview of me being anchored as a Coptic Orthodox Christian. So the Islamic invasion, of course, was negative in many ways, but God used it for good.
And I do want you to talk, as you talk about Athanasius, about the separating nationalism from Christianity. But I want to go back to, before I turn you loose and let you talk about Athanasius, I want you, the name of your church is St. Mark. Tell me about why St. Mark and what his importance in Coptic Orthodox Christianity.
Yeah, maybe I should have began with that. So if you look at, since like I mentioned, if we're talking about Orthodox Christianity being the fullness of the Christian worldview, the Christian movement, there is this beautiful continuity that we see from Jesus to the apostles, and that continuity continues. Actually, I know we'll talk about St. Athanasius, but one of St. Athanasius' very famous quotes is saying orthodoxy, or he used the word the Catholic Church, not Roman Catholic, but he's saying the fullness of the church is what Jesus taught, the apostles preserved, and the fathers kept. So you see this beautiful continuity. Part of that continuity, if you look at the 70 or 72 apostles, depending on what manuscript you're looking at, one of those apostles is Saint Mark. He was one of the apostles, and he was a first eyewitness of Jesus as a young man. You see him being mentioned even in his gospel writings, but in others, you see him being an integral role in the book of Acts, in which St. Luke records. So you see him being a pivotal role in the first century, in those first few decades of the Christian movement. He was appointed to bring the good news to the land of Egypt. He was not Egyptian himself. And this is an integral part for us to understand, that he is Libyan. He is from North Africa himself. But and then as he experienced Jesus, as he grew as a man of God and became more of a Jesus follower himself, and as he was appointed as an apostle to go to Egypt, he had to shift his mindset of understanding, okay, here is a foreign country, but how do I bring the fullness of Christianity to this foreign land? And it's this $1 million question, it's this framework which drives the Orthodox Church till today, of how do we bring the fullness of this first century church to America, to you name it, to Atlanta, where the culture of Atlanta might be different than Idaho, for example. Obviously it is. But what needs to drive that thought process, how do I bring the fullness of this pre-denominational church, the beautiful continuity of this Orthodox Church to this language, culture, you name it. So I need to have all. So St. Mark, the gospel writer, St. Mark himself is the founder and the first patriarch of the Coptic Orthodox Church. So he is someone who is very close, not only because of him being a companion to St. Paul the Apostle, not because he was the first eyewitness of Jesus, not just because his house himself, his parents' home, was the first church. You know, this is where the Last Supper was. This is where Pentecost was. So not only because of all that, is because he brought the good news to the foreign land of Egypt. And this was what rocked Egyptian history. And this is what sparked the Orthodox Church with the Coptic expression, the Alexandrian expression. And this is the establishment of the Coptic Orthodox Church.
Okay, I'm going to turn you loose, but I picked up on the fact that you affirmed that St. Mark was Libyan, as some may believe that Mark was European or whatever. He was not. He was from North Africa. And also it was his home, which the Last Supper, his home where they were in the upper room when Pentecost. It was, Mark plays a very pivotal role in the New Testament, but also in your church's history.
Yes, sir. I mean, it was integral. I mean, if you look at most places where the Coptic Orthodox Church continued to spread in the diaspora, many first churches are either named Saint Mary, being the mother of God, or Saint Mark, because of how close he is to our heart.
Now, what we started, thank you for that. We started this, the introduction in this conversation, talking about Athanasius and his importance in defending orthodoxy. Tell us what you know. Tell us why we should know his writings, like on the Incarnation. Tell us about St. Athanasius.
Sure. I mean, I know there's people who get their PhD in St. Athanasius, but I would just like to share some highlights of, for me personally, why he's close to me personally, and specifically the Coptic Orthodox Church. So he was born around the year 298 AD. And there, due to oral tradition, there is a beautiful story of him as a child, where he's playing with some friends. And of course, just like as many kids, like whatever they see, they want to emulate and kind of copy that. So here's some kids playing near a body of water, and they're kind of practicing or trying to copy what they see the priest do as far as baptism is concerned. So here are some kids playing, and they're, you know, dunking each other in the name of the Father, Son, the Holy Spirit. And, you know, there's like, oh, that's what the priest does. And they're kind of doing it. And there is a bishop who kind of is watching this unfold with the kids. And this bishop is by the name of Bishop Alexander. And he looks over and he sees the kids doing this. And one of those kids is St. Athanasius himself. And the bishop says, I know this is kids' play, but something tugged on his heart for him to realize that this is a valid baptism, that this is the mystery of baptism. This is the sacrament of baptism. And you can see the Holy Spirit working through Bishop Alexander, working through St. Athanasius, even as a kid. So you can even see in his childhood that he was very distinguished. There was something unique about him, that God has appointed him for in a pivotal point in history for the life of the church. And you can kind of see that in his childhood. One aspect I wanted to highlight of kind of what brought St. Athanasius as being one of the heroes of the church is that he fought against a heresy titled Arianism, which was kind of spreading throughout Egypt by a priest by the name of Arius. And this heresy, in a nutshell, was saying that God is limited, that there is an uncreated God, but his son is created. So in essence, that takes away the divinity of who Jesus is, of him being fully God and fully man. So, I mean, all Christians could agree that this is an integral part for us understanding the Christian worldview. So here is Arius being such an eloquent speaker, being it had the right connections. He was so smart. Like, he would take this heresy and even put it into songs, because we all know that once you take text and add it to music, it's able to penetrate the soul at a deeper level. It's able to go from head to heart. So Arius was taking advantage of that. But St. Athanasius knew in his heart, man, this is not the fullness of the truth. And he stood up for the truth. And as you mentioned, Odell, earlier, a common saying that came from this tension that existed between Arius and his followers and St. Athanasius is, as the movement of Arianism continued to grow, that people would tell St. Athanasius, listen, St. Athanasius, you're against the majority, you're against the world. And St. Athanasius stood up and says, well, I'm against the world. He stood up for truth. And it didn't matter how many people were following this heresy, that he knew in his heart who the reality of Jesus Christ was. And we'll kind of connect that in a little bit when it comes to the Ecumenical Council of Nicaea. But a third thing I want to highlight is him being connected with one of the founding fathers of the monastic movement, which is St. Anthony. Many Christians, regardless of the denomination, many historians, many Christians would say, and someone who played an integral role in the monastic movement for Christianity is Anthony the Great, or St. Anthony. Due to St. Athanasius's many exiles, he ended up becoming in connection with Anthony and wrote one of his most important works, which is The Life of Anthony, where you see so many great spiritual messages and stories from the life of St. Anthony. So St. Athanasius was able to capture the life and details and story of one of the most pivotal monks in church history by the name of St. Anthony, who was Egyptian himself. So even from the get-go, regardless of anyone's denomination, every Christian scholar, historian, or even the average Christian will have heard the word Athanasius and the word Anthony. And here are two people who have their roots from Egypt that are heroes in Christianity as a whole, and of course they're very dear to our heart, specifically in the Coptic Orthodox Church. Now, kind of going back to Arianism, as it was beginning to spread, and you see kind of this wedge happening, right? Some bishops were kind of going for Arius, some were not. There was this tension. There was a need for the church leaders to come together to discuss this, and for them to settle once and for all the divinity of Jesus. So the councils are an integral part to church history. They're an integral part to building the framework of the Orthodox worldview. Not the worldview, the Christian worldview, but specifically for us understanding the fullness of Christianity, specifically the Orthodox understanding of Christianity. So the ecumenical councils, there are numerous, but the first one, or one of the first ones, is happened in the city of Nicaea in the year 325 AD. So Bishop Alexander from Egypt was one of those appointed to go to the council. And he brought several people with him from Egypt as well, including a very young deacon by the name of Athanasius. And here comes this young guy probably still trying to figure out, what is this all about? And he's sitting there and he hears the tension between, people following Arius and those not following Arius. And he's hearing all this going back and forth. And he stands up and articulates himself in the most captivating way that make people start leaning in toward what this young deacon is saying. And they're so compelled by the way he's articulating himself, of how he's using so much logic of explaining the reality of Jesus being God in flesh. And this just compelled them. And from that council, if you look at the meeting notes and you kind of see what came out of that council, one of the most integral parts to Christianity that came from that council is the Nicene Creed, or we know it as the Orthodox Creed. Obviously, we see this in many of the apostolic churches, right? It's not necessarily just in the Orthodox Church. We see it recited in many other apostolic churches. This just shows that one of the pioneers of this piece of work that was so integral to Christianity, one of the leading people who was able to formulate the text for the creed, is St. Athanasius himself. So he was an integral part as a deacon, in front of hundreds of other church leaders and bishops. He was able to help construct this integral part to the Christian movement, which is the creed. The creed, you can look at it as like a mission statement for the church. Like, this gives us a direction of us understanding who God the Father is, who God the Son is, who God the Holy Spirit is. And then those are the three main elements. And then the fourth main element is understanding what the church is. So we see those four main elements that come from the creed. And I'll get to the fourth one later on as far as that, but you can see a clear understanding of who God the Father is, the second person of God, God the Son, and then who the third person of God, God the Holy Spirit. So we see all of them being expressed and articulated in a very clear way. And this was one of the fruits that came from the Council of Nicaea, and one of the leading roles who helped lead that was St. Athanasius himself. I just want to share a beautiful quote by a church father who loved St. Athanasius and what he said about him. This comes from St. Gregory of Nazianzus in the 4th century. He said these words about St. Athanasius: "When I praise Athanasius, virtue itself is my theme. For I name every virtue as often as I mention him who was possessed of all virtues. He was the true pillar of the church. His life and conduct were the rule of bishops, and his doctrine the rule of the Orthodox faith." Just to see his beautiful meditation of this great saint and hero of the church, you can see the impact St. Athanasius had, not only at the Council of Nicaea, but in his writings about the life of St. Anthony, of how he stood up for truth, even though he might have been against the world. He stood up for truth, even through the wide array of exiles in which he endured. He understood the truth, and he came with so much humility to it. Eventually, he was appointed as a patriarch in the Coptic Orthodox Church, one of the leads of the Coptic Orthodox Church. And just to show how beautiful the continuity and fullness of our ancient faith, that you have St. Mark being the first, and then fast forward, the 20th patriarch being St. Athanasius, and then here we are in the year 2022, talking about our current patriarch, Pope Tewodros II, who is the 118th patriarch of the Coptic Orthodox Church. So you see this beautiful continuity with no distortion. And what I always love to remind myself and those who come into the Orthodox faith is that your baptism can be traced down on paper and pen, can be traced down to the apostles themselves. How beautiful is that? My ordination as priesthood, the bishop who ordained me, I know the bishop who ordained the bishop who ordained the bishop, and so forth and so on, who ordained the patriarch, and I could go all the way back. I could go all the way back, man, to the guy who hosted the Last Supper. How amazing is that? How beautiful is that? To have that beautiful organic continuity of the church. No distortion, no division, no nothing. And through all of that, of course, there's evolution because of culture, because of various things. But the anchor, the root of that fullness of the church, how beautiful is that, man? That you can trace that back to Libya, to Alexandria, And now we're asking the same question in which St. Mark asked. How do I bring the fullness of this first century? Well, he didn't say the first century because he was there, but he was saying, how do I bring the fullness of this, of how my life was rocked by Jesus? How do I bring that and the full expression of that to this foreign land of Egypt? This should be the same question. This is the same question for me, as I'm speaking from my heart as a priest. This is the question that runs through my heart day and night. How? At the power of the local church of St. Mark Coptic Orthodox Church in which I serve at, how are we bringing the fullness of this Orthodox faith to my city of Atlanta? This is what drives the mission of our specific church. When it comes specifically to the Coptic Orthodox Church, the title in which we give St. Athanasius is that we call him St. Athanasius the Apostolic, not the apostle, because he was not one of the 72 apostles, but he was apostolic. In other words, he was apostolic-like. So we give him this honor of calling that he was not one of the early apostles, but because of his integrity, his spirituality, and him being a hero of the church, we give him the title of him being apostolic. Speaking of the word apostolic, one of the elements that came from the creed in which St. Athanasius helped construct at the Council of Nicaea in the year 325, they articulated very well, we believe in one God, who Jesus Christ is, who the Holy Spirit, the Comforter, is. And that out of anything else they could have written in this creed, in this 90-second prayer, out of anything else they could have added, they had a fourth element describing the church. And the language in which the church used to describe herself from the 4th century is the church being one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic church. This is the formal title of the church. Before there was division of the Roman Catholic Church and Martin Luther, before any of that, the fullness of the church wasn't even titled Orthodox. That had to come later. It was the one holy Catholic and apostolic church. This is the title of this living dynamic organism known as the church. This is, the fathers who were at this council were very intentional of using these words to describe the fullness of this body of Jesus being called the one holy Catholic and apostolic church. They did not connect this to any country, nation, or culture. Here is where we get to the point of the separation of nationalism from us being anchored as Jesus followers. They didn't add, they were sitting in a city of Nicaea, and they're coming from different countries. They did not want to add anything about a country because they understood what we're talking about transcends any culture, transcends any language, transcends any country. So it was very clear. If I look at the mindset of the church from the 1st century, from the early centuries, there was no idea of connecting it tightly with a country or the culture of a country or nationalism. That my identity, first and foremost, before it's connected to anything else, my identity is I'm anchored in the one who has my life in the palm of his hand. I follow Jesus, the one who redefined death and resurrection. This is my identity. And the lens of how I pursue him is in the one holy Catholic and apostolic church. It's that organic full version of the church. That's what I follow. So St. Athanasius, for crying out loud, the guy's Coptic. You can only just sit there and imagine. Was there any discussion of them saying, hey guys, we need to add the word Coptic in the creed? No, he knew. He's like, man, yeah, I'm Egyptian, I'm Coptic. But what on earth had that anything to do with me being a follower of Jesus? They understood me being a follower of the fullness of this 1st century church has nothing to do with Greece, nothing to do with Egypt, nothing to do with, I don't care what bishop, I don't care about any of that stuff. What made them anchored in Jesus is them understanding the fullness of the church. Has nothing to do with what country. That didn't impact St. Mark. For crying out loud, St. Mark, the guy's from Libya. And he's coming, he's not telling her, teaching, guys, here, Egyptians, come on, guys, let me tell you about the history of Libya. He didn't do that. He's like, okay, what is this language, Coptic? Teach me it. What is this Pharaonic temple? That's cool. But we need to change that key of life thing. It's supposed to be the cross. You're close. But what identifies us is the one who conquered death by the cross. This has to be the platform of what identifies us. So there was already a framework we see from the early centuries of them taking nationalism, language, culture being secondary to the fullness of the church. So we see that very clear if we look at the mindset of the church from the early centuries. So we see St. Athanasius, just by the way he was a hero in the church, how he led in constructing the Nicene Creed, which is integral to throughout much of the Christian world. Nationalism and connecting that with me being a Jesus follower, that's nowhere to be found. That's nowhere to be found. And even if you look at the patristic writings, the fullness of orthodoxy, I'm taking the writings of St. Augustine from North Africa, from Algeria, taking St. Augustine from Hippo, I'm taking a little bit of St. Ambrose from Milan, Italy, I'm taking all of it, even though they're in different languages over different centuries. All of it is the fullness of the one holy Catholic and apostolic church. And who embodied this so beautifully and lived out this till his last breath is St. Athanasius the Apostolic. So he is dear to our hearts, specifically the Coptic Orthodox Church, because of his heritage being Coptic, but that's not the driving force. Is that, yes, his blood was Coptic, but that's not why we honor him. That's not why we venerate him. It's because of the impact he has had in Christianity as a whole, and how he was integral to writing one of the most important pieces of work that we have in Christianity, which is the Creed. And no liturgical service in the Orthodox Church, I can only speak for the Orthodox Church, no service is ever done without reciting the Creed. So it is a common part of Orthodoxy, specifically the Coptic Orthodox Church, and Christianity as a whole. This is why St. Athanasius is so dear to all of us.
Thank you for that. Let me ask you a question, because how many times was he exiled? Or tell us about some of his exiles. Or
Sure. I mean, from what I remember, I think about 5 or 6 times he was exiled. And one of them eventually led him into the wilderness of the deserts of Egypt. And this would eventually led him to being with St. Anthony and the disciples of St. Anthony. But the details of each of the exiles, I don't want to misspeak, but I believe there's about 5 or 6 exiles in which he had.
The United Methodist, and I'll share that at the end, will be going to Egypt. And I believe that is in November. We will be headed November 1st to Egypt, and then we'll also be headed to Egypt in March of 2023. And we will learn more of what Father Girgis has taught us today. And I want to thank you for sharing with us what you know on Athanasius, as well as the history of the Coptic Orthodox Church. But before I let you go, I'm going to go off script. Let me ask you one thing. This information that you share with us generally is not taught in our seminaries. You have to go to an Orthodox seminary to find this information, or you have to read people like Thomas Oden in his book, The Rebirth of African Orthodoxy. You have to sort of do your own research on this. However, what is taught in a lot of American seminaries, particularly the mainline Protestant seminaries, are the Gnostic Gospels. And that sort of becomes the narrative of Christianity in Egypt, even though that is not well, let me ask you your opinion. I have an opinion on the Gnostic Gospels. Let me ask you what your opinion is, and what relationship do they have as it relates to Egyptian Christianity?
There's no question. Gnostic Gospels have captured the attention of Christian scholars and historians. And this is just my opinion. I think the framework of why it has captured everyone's attention is because it's new, it's innovative, it's cool, it puts a curveball on everything, right? I mean, it's the reflex, and it's of humanity. We want something new, innovative, right? Bigger, better, brighter, so forth and so on. This is what drives many Christians, and again, with all respect to every seminary, I know of people who have converted to Orthodoxy, and they would tell me from their Protestant seminary that their dissertation would have to be on something new, quote unquote new, something innovative, something different when it comes to Christian theology, something that maybe it's kind of there, but it's not really cool yet, right? So that's what drove them. That can't be any further than Orthodox understanding, right? For us, it's let's go back to the core. Let's go back to the first century before there was any distortion or dilution or different versions that kind of came. So it's the exact opposite. So since our reflex is all humans, regardless of worldview, we want something new, different, brighter, so forth and so on. This has attracted the attention of the manuscripts of the Gnostic Gospels that have come from Upper Egypt, from the city of Nag Hammadi and other places. They have captured the attention of Christian scholars, I believe, from that point alone.
Gotcha. And they don't fit, therefore, then in the center or near, they're not Orthodox. They're just not.
They are not part of the fullness of the Orthodox Church, but what the Orthodox understanding would be, we understand the fullness of the Church, in which Christ gave, which the life of the Church expressed liturgically in the first few centuries, that we have from the manuscripts and documentations of the epistles, what make up the Bible today, and other other manuscripts that exist outside of the Bible. That's the fullness of the Church. If something new is found, we have to take that and say, how does this fit into the richness and fullness of the Orthodox Church in which we understand? So it's not just this diluted views, is the Bible or not the Bible? It's not the Bible, then it's nothing. No, we don't, that doesn't exist. That never existed. I mean, the Bible came from tradition. The Bible came centuries later. What we know now is called the Bible, but that was never the case for the church. You know, they didn't get together at St. Mark's house after Pentecost and be like, guys, is it in the Bible? No, they didn't have that mentality. That came a lot later. So sorry, I'm kind of going off tangent here, but that would be the understanding. If something comes in the year 2040, that they find something else in Upper Egypt, they find, something from St. Mark in Libya. Well, even though he was a kid when he left Libya, but let's say they find something, but like, okay, cool. How does that connect to the first century or the first few century understanding and the fullness of the church? That's the driving question.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Let me end by asking you, where can people find you? Tell us about the church, how and where can we find you on social media?
Yes, sir. So I'm a priest of local church here in Atlanta, in the city of Sandy Springs. We're kind of renting around now, but we did plant permanent seeds to plant our roots in the city of Doraville. But our church website is stmarkatl.church. So stmarkatl.church. That's where you can find more information about our church, and we'd love for you to come over anytime to see us.
Thank you, Father Nathaniel Gerges. He is the pastor at St. Mark's American Coptic Orthodox Church. We thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Adele.